second favorite part of the evening. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the August 24th. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the August 24th your Planning Commission meeting. Why don't we go ahead and stand for the pledge? Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Right, good to see everyone. Thank you to all my fellow planning commissioners for joining. Ms. Pottas, if you would be so kind as to take roll, please. Possible off microphone. All right.
Okay. Commissioner Stevens,
Present.
Commissioner Goodbody, present. Commissioner Lowe, present. Commissioner Patterson, present. Commissioner Barb, present. Chair Alden Sullivan.
Present. Right, you're all here. It's nice to have everyone in person. All right, hopefully this should be a good meeting tonight. We'll start off with our public comment. We, as usual, will take public comment here in person or virtual from folks who wish to address the Planning Commission on items that are not up for discussion tonight on the agenda. I don't believe there's any public who are joining us today, and so I would ask Ms. Pottas if there's anyone online. If you are interested and you are watching and listening in and would like to provide public comment, please raise your hand and let us know. I believe we still have the Zoom function, yes? Great.
Yes, that is correct. We
Okay.
have 3 attendees at this moment and no hands raised.
Okay. All right, barring a hand popping up right now, we will go ahead and close public comment. And we will move on to the first item on the agenda this evening. The first item is a work session item. So this is a non-action item we'll be discussing, but we will not be taking any vote on the matter. So the first item this evening is the draft regulations for the Hayward Residential Design Study. And I believe we have our staff presentation to go over the meaty details with us. Ms. Blanton?
Correct.
All
Thank
right.
you. Good evening, commissioners. Elizabeth Blanton, senior planner. This evening, Taylor and I are back once again to talk about the Hayward Residential Design Study. When we spoke to you last in April, we focused on a series of options and recommendations for residential design. And in response to what we've heard, we have now have draft regulations for you to review. As you saw in the staff report and attachments for this item, there are pages and pages of Muni Code revisions and amendments being proposed as part of this project. And rather than exhaustively walking through them one by one, we're just going to be focusing this presentation on the most substantial changes. But that said, we'll be happy to go into detail about any one of the number of changes that we're proposing during the question and answer period following our presentation. So just like last time, this item is a work session, so we won't be asking you to take a vote or any specific action, but rather we're going to be looking for feedback on a series of questions that came at the end of your staff report. So as a quick refresher, just double checking you have next slide. There we go. As a quick refresher, the Hayward Residential Design Study is a strategic roadmap project with 2 primary components. So the main component is to develop objective standards for a residential development. And this is in response to recent state legislation that limits a city's ability to deny a housing project if it meets all objective standards or standards that are universally understood. There's no subjective interpretation involved with them. The second part of the project is to clean up some inconsistencies between the city's general plan and its zone ordinance. State law requires that a city zoning ordinance be consistent with its general plan. So this cleanup is going to help bring the city into compliance. So as you recall, since we kicked off the project in February of last year, we've completed a robust community engagement process. We established a project vision. We conducted extensive background research, and we developed a series of technical reports and analyses. And then all of that work is culminating into the draft standards that we're going to be reviewing with you this evening. So based on your feedback and the feedback that we receive from council next month, we'll make any necessary adjustments to these draft regulations and then bring them back to you for final adoption hearings tentatively scheduled for October. So before we dive into the draft regulations, let's first review the feedback that staff received at the last set of work sessions on the options and recommendations report. So collectively, the council and commission expressed support for increased building heights to meet allowable densities, flexibility and design diversity through menus of options or point systems rather than being overly prescriptive with our standards. Standards that establish a clear base, middle, and top of larger buildings. Upper floor step backs that help minimize boxy designs. And then also standards that support high quality open spaces, pedestrian and bicycle connections, and safety. So as shown in the staff report and attachments, we're proposing updates to the zoning ordinance, the off-street parking regulations, and the zoning map. Starting with the zoning ordinance, staff and the consultant team proposed consolidating the 4 residential zoning sections of the current code into a single section that will govern all 4 residential zoning districts, which are the residential natural preserve district, the low density residential district, the medium density residential district, and the high density residential district. Now, the eagle-eyed reviewers among us may have noticed that we've renamed the single family residential zoning district as the low density residential district. And this is not only just more consistent with the naming conventions of our other residential districts, but it's also just more neutral language that's more reflective and appropriate for the wide range of household types that we have here in the city. So within this new consolidated residential district section, some of the development standards are going to be based on zoning district, while others are going to be based on building type. So that is whether it's, say, a detached unit, a duplex or a triplex, or a multi-unit residential building that has 4 or more units. And by having some standards based on zoning district and others that are set by building type, this will ensure that development within each district kind of maintains the same scale, but will allow us to have different design standards for different scales of housing. So yard setbacks, for example, are proposed to be set by zoning district. Right now, all of our residential districts have the same setback requirements: 20 feet in the front and rear, 5 to 10 feet on the side yard, and 10 feet on a corner lot's secondary frontage, which is called the street side. So in our lowest density district, the RNP district, we're proposing maintaining these setbacks while actually increasing the side yard setback to 10 feet and the rear yard setback to 30 feet. In the RL district, we propose allowing homes slightly smaller setbacks for the front yard at 15 feet, while still requiring that the garages be set back 20 feet to allow for driveway parking. Additionally, we recommend reducing the side yard setback in the RL district to 5 feet, as this is just consistent with much of the existing housing stock in the city. Most people already have 5 yard setbacks, so it'll bring a lot of housing into compliance. Okay, now the biggest changes though are proposed for the RM and the RH districts, where we're recommending a 10-foot front yard setback, a 5-yard side yard setback, and a 10-foot rear yard setback. And as you might remember, what we learned in the options and recommendations report analysis that we brought to you a few months ago, these zoning districts don't currently provide a large enough buildable envelope to achieve the allowable densities. So reducing the setbacks for these districts will provide more developable area while still maintaining ample room for landscape buffers. Now, building heights are proposed to be set based on both zoning district and building type. So currently, heights of 30 feet are allowed in the RNP and RL districts, while 40 feet is allowed in the RN and RH districts. So we propose maintaining this 30-foot 2-story height limit for all allowable building types in the lower density RNP and RL zoning districts to help preserve the scale of these existing neighborhoods. However, in the RM and RH districts, we propose allowing duplexes and triplexes to be up to 40 feet tall or 3 stories, and for multi-unit development to be 50 to 60 feet tall with 4 or 5 stories. And once again, these proposed height increases would allow a larger buildable envelope to help ensure that projects can meet the allowable density. Now, one of the most exciting parts of the proposed residential code is this new subsection of design standards, which we did not have in the current code. Some of these standards will apply to all development, while others will only apply to certain building types. Many of the standards that are applicable to all developments were in our existing code in different places and were pulled over, but there are a handful of new standards that are applicable to all development. So first, as the commission recommended the last time we met, we proposed that new developments be required to install landscape buffers with evergreen trees if the new development is 15 feet or taller than the existing neighboring development next door. Secondly, we pulled some standards from the city's hillside design guidelines into this section, including one that requires all development that's on a slope of 15% or more to be stepped down the hillside. We've also added a standard that building entrances must be visible from the street or from a main pedestrian walkway to help promote safety. And then finally, we're requiring that retaining walls that are visible from the street be architecturally treated with attractive materials, colors, or landscaping. As we know, with development going up the hillside, we have a lot of just retaining walls. Now, for our smallest building types, detached units, duplexes, and triplexes, we're proposing additional standards related to building massing and facade. We heard from both decision makers and the community that upper floor step backs are desired to reduce the bulkiness of structures. So as a result, we propose limiting the upper floor of a detached home, duplex, or triplex to a maximum of 75% of the ground floor area. So for example, if the ground floor was 1,000 feet, the upper floor could be a maximum of 750 square feet. So this would allow architects to flexibly design the upper floor while still ensuring that at least some portion of it is stepped back. And then to promote further architectural interest, we're also proposing requiring that projects include at least 2 design features from a menu of options. That includes things like dormer windows, balconies, front porches, the use of a variety of building materials, special window moldings, and or projections or recesses. And again, by including a menu of options here, the goal is to ensure that we're still allowing for that diversity of design that the community wants, while also just promoting high quality housing. So for larger multi-unit buildings of 4 or more units, we propose some additional requirements. So for these structures, we suggest still limiting the upper floor, but this time to 85% of the ground floor area. And then in addition, for buildings that exceed 75 feet in length, like the one, for example, we see in this photo, projections or recesses would be required at regular intervals. And you can kind of see that here where like those balconies are pushing in and then parts of the building are projecting out. Like with the smaller building types, we also propose a menu of options of design features for multi-unit structures, but would require at least 3 be included in the design for these larger buildings. You'll also see the menu of options has been adjusted somewhat to be a little bit more appropriate for larger scale buildings. And then finally, again, as recommended by this body, we propose a series of standards that require our largest buildings, our 4- and 5-story buildings, be designed with a distinct middle or base, I should say, middle and top, again, similar to what we're seeing in this image. So the final portion of the new residential section of the code that I'll highlight here are some proposed updates to the open space standards. So as requested, we made the new open space standards clearer, requiring 150 square feet of open space for dwelling units in projects that have 4 or more units. Open space can be private or common, it can be indoor or outdoor. But to ensure that the open spaces are high quality, we're proposing a new point system based on the size of the project. So shown in this table, projects would be required to earn between 50 and 200 points for the open space amenities that they provide. Now, as detailed in the staff report, you can go to that slide first. And on the slide here, individual amenities are listed between 15 and 75 points each, kind of based on the desirability of the amenity and or just how many people can accommodate at one time. Now, we're not going to spend time during this presentation reviewing each amenity on this list, but we are happy to take any feedback you have. If you want to adjust point totals or add things to the list or take things off the list, so we can get to that during the discussion period. And now I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Taylor to take us the rest of the way.
Good evening, Planning Commission and Hayward community. Firstly, I want to highlight some of the proposed changes to the city's off-street parking regulations. The draft regulations are based on the findings within our parking analysis and feedback from the Planning Commission, City Council, and community. One of the draft regulations is adding a parking reduction for residential projects that include certain TDM or transportation demand management measures. For a 10% reduction, a project shall include a on-site transit route map / schedule and a car share vehicle with an annual membership to the car share program available to all residents. For 50% reduction, the project shall include either a class 1 or class 4 bicycle facility throughout the development connecting to an existing or planned bike route identified in the city's bike and pedestrian master plan. Alternatively, they could also provide a bus shelter for any bus route within a quarter-mile radius of the site. For a 20% reduction, the project shall either include a one-time financial contribution set by the Public Works Director for bike, pedestrian, or transit-related capital improvement projects identified in the CIP or capital improvement program. Or alternatively, they could provide monthly bus passes to all residents at no cost in perpetuity. We propose a minimum of 1 bus pass per bedroom be made available. The selected TDM measures were based on best practices and analysis of other cities' regulations, including but not limited to San Francisco's very successful TDM program. Another draft regulation is allowing for the unbundling of parking, which is currently explicitly prohibited by our current regulations. This will allow the cost of parking to be unbundled from the cost of housing, granting residents cost savings if they forego a car. If the residential development chooses to unbundle their parking, they must provide a notice within the common area of the buildings to ensure all residents understand the cost savings. This was closely modeled on the City of Oakland's unbundled parking policy. One of our draft regulations is reducing parking requirements for senior and special needs housing to 0.5 covered spaces and 0.3 covered spaces per unit respectively. The city currently allows parking reductions for senior and special needs housing if very specific findings are made. However, research shows that these populations tend to have a significantly lower parking demand. Transform, a transportation advocacy group, also found that an average of 49% of parking spaces in some of Hayward's senior special needs and affordable housing developments are unused. The last draft parking regulation I want to highlight is allowing tandem parking for all multi-unit developments if the tandem spaces are assigned to the same unit. This is currently only allowed in very specific circumstances. This change, however, will allow developers flexibility to meet their parking requirements, especially on constrained sites. Moving along to our next topic I want to highlight is creating consistency between our Hayward 2040 general plan and the zoning ordinance. Currently, there are 857 low density residential RL, formerly known as single family residential RS zone parcels that have an inconsistent general plan land use designation. For all these parcels, the general plan requires a higher density than what is currently allowed by the zoning. The state requires that the general plan and the zoning be consistent, and when they are not consistent, the general plan prevails. We are proposing 2 methods to correct these inconsistencies. The first are some zoning amendments. This method will be used for parcels that have an RL zoning in either a limited medium density residential LMDR or a medium density residential MDR general plan land use designation. The amendments include removing density regulations from the zoning ordinance and allowing the properties to build at the density specified within the general plan. Building types were added to ensure the units match the existing surrounding development form. The other method to correct the inconsistencies is rezoning properties. This method will be used for the parcels that have RL zoning in either a commercial high-density residential, CHDR, or a high-density residential HDR, general plan land use designation. Rezonings are needed given these inconsistencies are much greater than the ones I previously mentioned. However, as you can see on the map, there are very few parcels that require a rezoning. For the rezoning, staff and our consultant chose the most appropriate zoning district based on what the existing development is and what the surrounding development is already. A list of all 49 parcels to be rezoned are included in the agenda packet. These properties were notified via mail about the rezonings and invited to attend this meeting. The last item I want to cover tonight are some topics we would like the commission's input on. We have not drafted anything for these items yet, but are just seeking feedback on how to proceed. As you may know, areas of Mission Boulevard and Downtown Code have their own specific regulations. Unlike the Downtown Code, the Mission Boulevard Code has limited objective design standards. We believe there is a great opportunity to include some of these regulations we discussed today within that code. Additionally, either as part of this project or as part of a subsequent project, staff believes there is an opportunity to create regulations in a process to allow for small lot detached residential subdivisions without a rezoning. Our current and proposed regulations do not allow for this development form, since these developments typically have 4,000 square foot lots and reduced setbacks. Within this last several years, the commission and council have reviewed several of these development types and approved their rezonings. That rezoning process is more costly, takes longer, and requires more significant environmental review. That being said, this is a very popular development form, not only with the Hayward community, but also with developers, which may be a reason why we want to promote it. And with that, we are looking for input from the commission on the following questions. Should we create standards in a process for small lot residential development? Should we include any of the standards we discussed today within the Mission Boulevard Code area? And do you support the updated development and design standards, parking regulations, and the point system for the open space amenities? As Elizabeth mentioned, there are other proposed cleanup and changes to the code within the red line detachments, which we didn't explicitly cover in this presentation. However, staff is more than happy to discuss any of those changes and answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Blanton. Thank you, Richard. Anything else from staff or Michelle?
Just one note I forgot to mention, our consultant or design consultant from WRT, Poonam Narkar, is also participating virtually. I believe I'm confirm that is true. So she'll also be available to help answer questions if you have any for her.
Great. All right, so many thoughts for you all. I will hold my fire here though. But first off, just thank you for getting lots of things, but I can only imagine the voluminous amount of work and time and effort that went into this just from what we read. So excellent work on the part of the city for getting through this and getting us to this point, and excited for what it means for Hayward. So why don't we go ahead and open it up to commissioner comments or questions. Is it possible to put the slide with your 6 questions up on screen just for us to keep track of anything that might be helpful to guide our discussion here? Perfect. All right, who would like to start? Commissioner Gard, please.
First, thank you very much. A lot of work went into this, and thank you also for synthesizing it to kind of the key points. I had one question related to the landscaping requirements, particularly given that the setback requirements are being reviewed as well. Kind of just understanding fire safety and what thought has been given to the fact that we're going to be living in an era. We're building housing stock now, going into an era of increased fire risk in any area of California. So I'm just curious.
It's a good question. We don't have any standards proposed as type of landscaping in this project, except that generally in the city, all landscaping development has to be consistent with water efficient landscaping ordinance for the city. We are updating our tree ordinance currently, so some work will be coming forward to you guys from that. Generally speaking, though, in terms of setbacks, structures themselves have fire rated walls that help with making sure that fires are not moving from one place to another. The landscaping itself, our fire department runs several programs to say, like, especially in our hills area, to like cut weeds back and like help manage and the potential fire issues up there. The standards themselves, again, don't specify like what types of plants have to be in the landscaping setbacks, but the setbacks themselves are consistent with the size of the landscaping buffers. That help answer something we should
Yeah,
into potentially.
that is helpful. I would be curious, or I would be interested, particularly again looking at what are the predicted increases in fire risk in the city of Hayward Department predicted over the next few decades, and just kind of understanding the interplay between whether these design standards are really kind of forward looking in terms of the climate risk
Yeah.
that our city will have. Can I ask a second question? Kind of related to that, I mean, I think the other question I have is around egress for the especially the higher density areas. Again, just kind of understanding how the interplay between that and thinking about if we were to experience a very fast moving, city driven factors, something like what unfortunately the community in Maui recently experienced. How are these design standards? Could they actually make something worse, or could they actually make it easier to evacuate? Situations like that.
That's a good question. Because life safety is paramount above all things, fire code trumps anything in our zoning ordinance. So our fire department are one of the people that are helping. We've checked in with them about several different standards. We have standards about like setbacks and things like that we've checked in with our fire department for. However, let's say fire code updates in the future as we have wildfires like this in California. Some of our communities have been hit by these kind of firestorm events. None of these standards would supersede fire code. So we would always be consistent with that. Our fire department, we have actually a fire protection engineer on staff, which not all cities do. And so she takes a careful look at all development projects coming through to make sure the projects themselves have proper egress, but then also to make sure for some of our developments, especially developments up in the hillside where there are like limited access roads, that there's proper egress and evacuation routes and things like that to keep our residents safe.
Commissioner Stevens, please.
Thank you very much. So I'm a big fan of the small lot subdivision, and it's my understanding, and it's something that I've seen in the marketplace, very, very common in the Bay Area. They're cheaper to build, right? And the market shows that people don't want to live and share a wall. So I really, really would encourage you to explore that more. And I should disclose, I know Poonam very well. She's a colleague of mine, so I don't get harms my authority to talk. So anyways, I'm going to ask too about the high density residential and the 10-foot setback. Just curious about why we want to have the 10-foot setback. I know on a lot of form-based codes and in various other developments, when we have a very high density residential, we usually build it right up to the right of way line. Is there a reason why we are holding it as 10 feet?
That's a good question. Taylor and I, with working with our consultant team, we're trying to play with this tension that we were hearing from the planning commission, from community members, but really wanting to hold those setbacks to have some of those buffers, those landscapes as we did our neighborhood walks through the different neighborhoods that people really enjoy. But also recognizing that a high density residential district is really trying to support a more dense housing type that doesn't, support the full 20-foot setback that you would see in a detached home. So that's where we landed in these proposed recommendations. But again, we're open to, if you think a smaller setback would be more appropriate, but for maybe the RH or the RM, that's something we can certainly look into and adjust before we come back with 5-foot standards.
And building on that, but with open to things, just providing some context. The RH district is still not as dense as our downtown and our Mission Boulevard, which have a range of 0 to 10 feet about where you can set the building. So just being aware that these are not as dense as some of our really dense areas.
Yeah, that's a good point. Density, as Taylor explained, will be determined by the general plan, but generally speaking, density in our RH district usually caps out about 34 units per acre.
And I totally get that. I think that's great. My question, I'm just trying to think of when this could occur. Let's just say we have a development and it's a block and the sidewalks there are 10 or 12 feet wide, so they're very robust sidewalks for an urban environment. Then we have another 10-foot setback. That almost seems like too much use of space. I mean, it just seems like you could combine sidewalk and setback. Like if it, I don't know, it feels too much, but it's just my opinion. And then the only other question I had was, I'm really glad about the 15 feet ground floor, section 10-1.204. But I was thinking about one other issue here. So that is if you have a building that exceeds the height of another building by 15 feet. But let's just say I build a building and my building is 10 feet higher, but it's placed, the elevation is raised 5 or 6 or 7 feet above the adjacent property. So now I'm sitting, 15 plus feet proud of that other parcel of land. So is there a way we could somehow incorporate fills as well as height? Because the idea was to sort of make it so I don't feel like I'm in the shadow of some giant building.
Yeah, that definitely happens in Hayward. I mean, Taylor, specific project Taylor reviewed, where that was the neighbor's concern, was there was a significant grade change between one property to the next. The way the definition for height in Hayward is measured from the existing or finished grade, whichever is lower, to the top or to the midpoint of the roof of the structure. So if that grade change is existing, then no, the standards as proposed wouldn't address that. It would just address if it was, if the height difference based on where those grades are. But if say that somebody did have to fill for the project, they had to pad up for one reason or the other to level something out, then that height would be measured from wherever that existing grade was before the project was graded and developed.
Okay, so there's a definition somewhere in the front that, okay. got it.
Correct,
Okay,
yeah.
perfect, that's all, that's great. And then my only other pitch, I'm really, really excited to see the points in here. And I'm really excited by the points in open space. I think they're really fair, and I think they're a really good distribution. I'd like to advocate again for architectural points. So while I think open space points are great, I think architectural points are almost more important to the people that will not be living in this area. So I again would make the pitch for, if we like arcades and galleries or different things like this, I think that really should be part of it, because that's the experience that the rest of the community of Hayward will experience. So I think that's really important.
So just to clarify, say like, instead of a menu of options for design features, maybe we assign those design features points and we say you have to have 15 for this project, 20 for this project, something like that.
Yeah, something to make them achieve a bar, a minimum bar.
Okay.
That makes sense.
Okay.
Thank you. I appreciate this. This is awesome work. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Stevens. Commissioner Lowe, please.
Thank you. As I was going through all the materials, I just kept pausing and thinking, wow, how much work went into this. It's amazing. So thank you for all your hard work and thank you for your presentation. So I have a few questions. I have a lot of notes, so I've got to go back and find it. So let's start at the beginning. My first question has to do with something that I brought up before. So I want to go to attachment 2, page 14, and specifically 10-1.209, site plan review required. And it said the site plan review approval shall be required before issuance of any building or construction permit only if the planning director determines that a project materially alters the appearance and character of the property or area or may be incompatible with city policy standards and guidelines. And so I wanted a little bit of clarification, because as I interpret that, it sounds like exactly what I talked about a couple of meetings ago. I'm concerned with the planning commission and city council approving something, thinking we know what we've approved. The community thinks that they know what's been approved, and then all of a sudden something different is being built because they were able to go back and get a to make that change. You understand what I'm saying? And the fact that it says that shall be required before issuance of any building or construction permits only if the planning director determines this. That word only worries me a little bit. Can you talk on that?
Yeah. This is exactly as written in our current code, just so this is what we do now. Our planning director is really our planning manager, so I'll let Jeremy add to anything if I leave anything out, but basically this means that any new project, if we say it will alter the appearance of a street or a neighborhood, we can require site plan review. We require it goes through a planning review process first. A site plan review is an administrative process, so it's usually reviewed and approved by staff unless it has like a tract map or something that would require it to move up to the planning commission level or if it was appealed. So we always have the right to put a project through that process. Sometimes we do waive projects from site plan review. For example, if somebody has a single family or a single story home and they're doing an addition in their backyard and no one's going to see it, rather than making them go through the process of site plan review, which usually takes a few months and costs some money, there's some costs associated with that. We'll look at the project. If it meets all of our standards, we'll go ahead and let them go straight to the building permit process. So this line here about only requiring site plan review in some circumstances, most of the time, if it's something you can see from the street, it's something a neighbor might be concerned about, if it's something we want to notice the neighborhood to let them know if this new thing is happening, it's something that we'll put through the site plan review process. We tend to only waive that site plan review. We can pretty confidently say, like, this is not something that's going to be felt by the neighbors, be seen by the neighborhood. It's not going to change the visual structure of the street in any significant way. Jeremy, I don't know if you have anything to add.
No, I think you captured most of it. We, by default, we always require, in most cases, site plan review. That's the baseline. If someone's coming in and let's say, as Elizabeth pointed out, what they're proposing is relatively consistent with what everyone else in the neighborhood has, though, and it meets setbacks, it meets all the other development standards, those would be instances where we would waive site plan review and not subject the homeowner to a discretionary process, which includes noticing of neighbors, includes all that stuff. On the flip side, we've also had instances where we have individual homeowners in a single family neighborhood with ones that are, the neighborhood is built as a one-story neighborhood, probably back in the 50s, 60s. And let's say an applicant wants to come in and add a second story, which would be the only two-story house in the neighborhood, maybe doubling the size of any other house in the neighborhood. In those instances, we would most likely require site plan review just for purposes of transparency and give the opportunity for the public to weigh in, to give the opportunity for any other stakeholder to be able to provide input. And because adding that second story in an otherwise neighborhood of single stories would materially change the character of that street, of that frontage, at least along that roadway frontage. And so we mostly default to site plan review, which is our discretionary process, because we do really embrace transparency and being able to communicate to the public. But because you have to, there is some element of discretion. We do sometimes for smaller projects. We have waived that in the past, something that we've determined. And like I said, or if it happens to be a controversial project, and we know that by certain groups or neighborhoods that we've talked to, maybe there's some sensitivity in the neighborhood, we will often require site plan review for that as well.
So I might be way off then, because what I was thinking is that this was like the development, I can't remember the name of it, the development that's by Holiday Bowl, where it seemed like there was some minor, the developer came back and said, I have minor changes, and then it didn't seem to be what the community thought they were getting. Is this something different?
Well, there's a couple things at play. So site plan review is something that would typically, usually for a project that has not already been reviewed and vetted, would be for new projects or new applications. Oftentimes when you have a project that has already been approved and vetted, there are policies and allowances in the existing unit code that allow for minor alterations. And that happens with nearly every project that has ever been approved by staff, approved by the planning commission or by council. They all go through a series oftentimes of changes. Often, and the reason being is because at the point when projects come before these bodies, including staff, they're conceptual. Most of the construction developers have not gone through detailed construction level documents. There may be comments or code changes that have transpired from when it originally was approved by the city to at the point when they're pulling building permits, which force some design changes. There may be new solar requirements or new safety requirements for the building code. So oftentimes that does happen, and we do see that. And still, there is some discretion that we have to exercise. I mean, obviously, if we're looking at a project and what was approved is a 2-story multifamily project, and what the applicant is wanting to do is a 3-story, that's not minor, that's a fairly significant. But if they're changing from one color of siding to a different color of siding, a slightly different tint of shade, or they're changing landscaping materials, that may be something that we could entertain at staff level as a minor modification. I will also just point out from personal example, we had a project, I won't mention which project it is because I don't think it really matters, but we had a project a couple of years ago that was approved with very wonderful, ornate, detailed garage doors and detailed front doors. And the architect and the applicant had every intent to add those. But then the pandemic hit and shortages happened, and they couldn't acquire these products anymore. And so they were forced to either not complete the project as promised to the people they were trying to sell these homes to, or swap out materials for something that would be similarly or like material. And that was an instance where we looked at the before and after and thought it was not a material change enough that would cause a significant problem for the community or for the decision makers, and we would approve that.
And were people satisfied with that?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, and so, because the thing that I was hearing is that, or with what I remembered, was that some people weren't pleased with the way that the ones near Holiday Bowl turned out. And I was told that that had to do with some sort of a minor change that they were told was going to happen, but it ended up being a major change, and they did not have to come back to the planning commission or the city council in order to make the minor change, but it ended up being a material change.
And there are instances like that where for one reason or another, certain materials are not, are not accessible or not readily available. I would also say too, that as we all know, when we have a project that comes before the commission or even before staff, architects do an amazing job at painting a very pretty picture. And I'll just, it happens, and they're doing exactly what they need to do, which is to sell their proposal. And when you see a construction site that's still under construction and it doesn't look like that pretty picture because maybe the trees aren't mature or maybe the plants haven't been installed yet, you're going to see some pushback. And, so sometimes we just need to exercise a little patience before the perceived pretty picture turns into a reality, which may take some time.
Wanted to go to sorry, I'm trying to skip some of these questions because I have a lot of questions. Okay, so I noticed a couple of places here we said handicap accessibility, and I was just wondering if that is still a politically correct term.
I know in our parking code, and I don't know all the places you're referencing, you could certainly do a search. Some of our code dates back to the 60s, so definitely we have better terminology now than we did at that point. I know in our parking code, it terms persons with disabilities, but I'm not sure. There might be references in places that we can certainly search for and use better language.
Okay, and I can point them out to you later if you want.
We'll take those.
But I just thought that we should update that. And I don't know how much I should get to the weeds, so let me move on. There's one last thing that I'll ask that I really want to ask. In the parking, attachment 4, street parking. 10-2.404. I'm sorry, 405. And I was wondering, why did we take out the credit for senior citizen? And it said, and that's another place where it said handicap, but we took it out anyway, so it didn't matter.
So in this case, this section was replaced by on to 10-2.310, we added a reduced parking rate for senior and special needs housing in there, so they just get that rate without having to request a reduction, which is what was deleted from.
Got it. Okay, and I saw the 2, but I didn't understand quite how they relate to one another, so I didn't
And
understand.
I'll note here, we are aware of other words that are better than special need housing. Special needs housing applies to a very specific code in the California Government Code. So we use that to make sure the reference works and to make sure that we are using that legal definition. That's why that language is used here.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that we are always, making sure we're inclusive, that's all. So any other questions I have, I think I will table them for the moment. Thank you.
Commissioner Mo. Please, Commissioner Goodbye.
Thank you. So I have a question on the staff report. To fund residential transportation systems management program. And I fully appreciate the efforts and feedback from the community and from Transform about the reduction under these projects, but I was concerned that the reductions might make it harder for the multifamily developments to accommodate those families that live in those developments, just the nature of having kids and multi-generational families living in my unit, where you've got to take, one child to one school and another child to another school, and plus get yourself to work. And so I would just really encourage staff to be a little flexible and be cognizant of the needs of families that are living in those developments that actually need cars.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Do you think it would be, and again, this is something we're all open to feedback for, the rates that are being reduced from 10 to 20%, those could be reduced to maybe smaller percentages, and or the TDM measures that are required to get those rates, we could also change those. We could augment those. Like I said, our consultants, Taylor especially, did a lot of research in the community. It seemed like this might be a good place to start, but we definitely don't need to land here, and this is not what feels appropriate.
I like the measures. I like the choices of, the bicycle facilities or, the bus passes. I know the council supporting that as well. But what I think where I'm kind of going is that, a monthly bus pass won't help a family of 4 or 5 that's living there. So I think the categories are fine. Maybe you want to play around with the percentages. Thank you, Jeremy. Yeah, I think that, like I was saying, that those measures I think are I think maybe just playing around with the reductions, or maybe adding another measure, or kind of I think just some flexibility.
Okay, helpful. Take a look.
Any other comments? That was all for you.
That's all for now.
Okay, great. Commissioner Patterson, go ahead.
Thanks.
So I just like to thank staff for the presentation and for all of the work that went into the staff report and all the attachments. And also thank you for answering my questions. I did just want to address your questions a little bit. I don't have answers to all of them, but I do really appreciate the intentional language. I felt like that you tried to include around unbubbled housing, and you heard our feedback around that. So that was appreciated, just to make it hopefully less of a burden to anyone who would be a burden for, and just being just a very positive TDM measure. I do like the point system. I thought that was great. I don't have any real feedback about whether there should be other amenities or anything like that, but I just did want to say I was excited to see that as well. And I had fun kind of calculating where I live, like how many points they would have gotten for that. I also, to echo a little bit of what Commissioner Goodbody just said, I did wonder a bit about the ratios. And so I did appreciate the public comment because that we received from Transform, because they mentioned a study that they did around that to get like, oh, we know that this is somehow going to be appropriate for the community, but I still have a little feeling there of I mean, in the beginning of the staff report, you all said, and I quote, it says we're trying to have standards that involve no personal or subjective judgment. And so I just really hope that whatever we land on, that it's really backed up as much as possible. Like I know you just said you did a lot of research around it, but as much as it could be not arbitrary, I think would be helpful, because I do also worry that based on what some people experience or believe, it could be lower than it might need to be for larger families living in a multi. So did want to say that. And then also one of the questions that I asked before the meeting had to do with 3 different standards or sections in attachment 4 about the off-street parking, and they were all about reductions for being near transit or transit shelter. And so I'm just wondering if it's possible when there's things like that, because again, it said something about having an objective standard that's written in a way that anyone reading it could understand it. And we also got a public comment about that. And so I struggled with it. It helped to hear your or just read the explanation of how those 3 things were different. But I was like, is there a way they could all like together? But I don't know if that's even possible. So that's just a question I wanted to bring, because reading it and then going through it and then seeing something else, and it was just, it's a little bit difficult.
They're hard to find, yeah.
Yes.
And that's one of the things we're definitely trying to do with this project, is to consolidate information, organize it in a way that's easier to find what you're looking for. I will say, as you saw, we totally rewrote the residential section. We didn't do redline, we looked at the same because we moved everything and like made it into a new format. Other parts of the code, like the off-street parking regulations, since it addresses all development and not just residential development, some things we rearranged, some things we left together. We can certainly, I would say, do more organizational work to try to make that a little easier to navigate as well. But yeah, the reason some parts of the code look very heavily touched and organized is because they totally focus on residential, where other things are a little bit in the purview of this project, halfway in the purview of this project. But I think we could certainly take this as an opportunity to kind of put at least light topics together so that people aren't digging through years of updates that are sometimes in odd places.
Thank you. Go ahead, Commissioner Gordon.
Thank you. I actually had a couple of follow-up questions related to the parking, the TDM and parking reduction percentages. I was happy to see them, and I also, it's always challenging when you do that. So I was happy that there were certain requirements like connectivity to kind of propose bike routes and things like that. But I think one question I have is that to say, well, it's transit accessible can mean a lot of things, given how what are the bus routes, for example, how frequently do they come? Because I also think there's a little bit of a market incentive here. The developer has the discretion to reduce off-street parking, but it's not a requirement. And so I'm curious though, to what extent is there any consideration given to, in some areas in Hayward, you have bus routes that are served very late.
Yeah.
And so if I remove off-street parking for a bus that comes like, a few times a day on weekdays, that is very different than the park, for example.
I will say, and Taylor, please jump in here if I miss anything, but we kind of talked about that at the beginning. Should some of these TDM strategies be based on, say, like proximity to transit or transit headways or things like that? That didn't land in our final policy, but I don't see why it couldn't. So if we wanted to offer these sort of reductions only in areas that are within a proximity of BART or within, buses that have 20-minute headways or what have it be, I think that'd be totally reasonable. Taylor Star parking is very under that.
I think the one caveat to that is they may not be as well used if it's by BART, because those areas through AB 2097 were granted by the state a reduction to parking to 0, so they don't need to include TDM measures. But especially, I think there's room to do it with bus stations specifically with certain headways. I think there's room to do it as that, but I would just say around BART, they're already allowed to do.
And maybe it's like, just thinking out loud here, but maybe it's also like, for example, one of the options or requirements is for car share. So that's not dependent on transit. So maybe it's like, we figure out some sort of way to add requirements that for each one, maybe like one's a transit kind of related thing, and then one is, you know, scooters or car share or something that's like not as dependent on living close to a bus line. We can definitely dig more into this. It's a lot of digging to do in TDM.
Can I ask a follow-up thing?
Sure.
So yeah, I mean, I appreciate like that. If we think about kind of creatively what the, I mean, again, these are structures that are likely to be here for several decades. And so kind of thinking about what the community might look like 30 to 50 years from now. I imagine it will be denser. I imagine even just the way people use cars will be quite different by then, with, you know, different technology changes. So I kind of appreciate that it's important to build for the future, and a big part of that is going to be reducing off-street parking. But I think, you know, thinking creatively, incentives for providing shuttle services, or you mentioned car sharing. I know that, you know, with the advent of and there are even automotive companies that sort of do in multi-resident and multifamily housing, car share that also includes charging stations and you know, other types of incentives. So kind of thinking creatively, because this will presumably be a code that lasts for quite some time. I would love to see a little bit more of that.
Thank you. All right. I have a few questions. I appreciate all the comments from my fellow commissioners. A lot of good discussion so far. I'll just kind of rapid fire at you guys, if that's all right. First thing, slide 11 on your presentation. Just to clarify, the point value is the point you need to meet,
Yes.
correct? No, okay. So when I read that at first, I thought you're saying, well, if you build a project with 4 to 10 units, you get 50 points. So terminology there, it might,
Correct.
maybe I'm the only one that missed that, but maybe it should say point minimum or something of the sort.
That makes sense.
All right, on the points, I think this is really interesting because I know it's come up in our discussions before. Looking at one of the smaller projects, so what struck me is by doing the math, a multi-unit project could theoretically meet the system with a single item. And I wonder if that is indeed our goal, or if we want to relook at sort of the point allocation so that you need to have a few things before you actually meet that threshold versus just one. Just a thought. I'm not sure if that's the intent here, but something that struck me.
Yeah, I'll add quickly to that,
Yeah.
just to clarify. So yeah, so for a smaller project, a 4 to 10 unit project with the threshold is 50, there are items on this list that are worth 50 points.
Right.
You can certainly adjust that. Maybe nothing's worth 50 points. Maybe 4 to 10 isn't the right range. Maybe it's 4 to 5 can have one,
Sure.
you know, or something, and then 6 to 10 have to have 4 points. That's certainly something that we can adjust if we're kind of in agreement that one amenity is not going to be enough for a 10-unit development. Taylor and I played with all of these, and we were trying to think about combinations like, okay, development this size could have this and this, and that would make the points total, but that seems feasible. But again, this definitely could probably use some massaging if anyone on this body has specific suggestions. We're happy to tweak it.
So I love the point system. I think we just need to perhaps play with the numbers.
Okay.
As far as sort of other items that might be on there, again, getting granular here, but what about 5 points for a bench? Right, a bench is super useful, or 10 points for a table with a bench next to it. What about a water fountain? I think these are all simple things that add value to the street experience or the residential experience. Playground, I can't remember the points that you have, but I noted I put here playground should be worth more.
Okay.
It seems sort of low, I guess. I think that's a very sort of attractive amenity. Again, depends on
reference, so up for.
How many is it?
40, it's at 40 right now, so maybe.
Again, these are, others might have different opinions, but I do think of, the amenities, I think playgrounds have, good usefulness. Additional landscape areas, so you note, that I think there's a point for lawn area. Lawns take a lot of water. I know it's nice to be able to walk on a lawn, but it does take a lot of water, so perhaps that could just be landscaped area, right? Every certain square footage of landscaped area is worth a certain amount of points versus
Yeah.
just lawn area.
Lawns, just for everybody, are at 15 points now. We also struggled with that because we're team no lawns, but then,
Yeah.
I have nephews that are 3 and they just live.
Right, some people like it, yeah,
So
exactly.
wanting to allow for that, and maybe it's like turf or something and it's on a lawn,
Sure.
but yeah, we hear that.
And then sort of in the similar vein, swimming pool, I think was worth 50. Look, I love a swimming pool, I love a swimming pool and a hot tub, but I wonder if that's the right amenity to have at 50 points. And then I also wonder from a land use, you're paving over a lot of land that is now impermeable, plus you're using a lot of water. So maybe it's not the best use to be encouraging significant water use like that, so.
And just to clarify, we actually have swimming pool at 75. so
Oh,
it's not
sorry,
like
yeah,
that's
okay, that seemed
significantly
egregious in
much
there, yes, that, just my thoughts there. So that's thoughts on points. Let's see, special needs and or senior parking reduction. Wouldn't want to make any assumptions, but it sounds like that is indeed the case, and so by reducing those numbers, I think it's a win-win, so supportive of that. Unbundling parking, also supportive of that. However, question for you, how would a developer be able to predict demand here? And where I'm getting at is if I'm building a 400 unit condo development, let's say, or a 100 unit apartment building, I have to plan if I'm gonna have underground parking or single story parking or whatnot. If I want to unbundle it, I don't know who's going to take the parking, so I can't plot out how many spots I need. So there's sort of a catch-22 with that.
And just to clarify, the unbundled parking doesn't set the number of spaces. They would be required the number of spaces
still
in the
have to.
parking. Yeah, so say
Okay.
that, development, that border
Yep.
development is required 800 spaces.
Yep.
They'd still have to give us 800 spaces, would actually be more. than that.
So next point, there's a disconnect there then, because perhaps again, if the idea about unbundling is reducing the need for parking and only folks who really, really want it, you might get folks that end up, no one wants a parking space. Now we've just created unnecessary parking.
I would say my understanding of unbundling parking is it's more of adjusting the allotment of parking for that exact example of say larger families. So my household, my husband and I, we share a car. We have one car. We've always had one car for the last decade. There are other people that live in our complex who have 3 kids. They have 2 parents, like one of the kids is a teenager, so maybe they need 3 cars. So it's saying like in an instance like that, instead of giving my husband and I 2 spaces and that other family 2 spaces, they could buy our 3rd space, not from us, but we would have cheaper rent. They could have an extra space. So it's more about, you're right, it's not addressing the parking demand issue. That's where the TDM comes in. It's more addressing you don't want to have empty spaces because one household is assigned it and they don't need it. You want to be able to give that to someone else in the complex.
Again, very supportive of it. It'll be fascinating to see what happens 20 years of doing this. To the next point, TDM. So my thoughts on parking come from being on homeowner boards in multiple buildings, including fortunately or fortunately being the president of my homeowner association right now. The number one issue by far is parking. That is the number one issue. And so the challenge here, I think a lot of this is very aspirational and I love the ideas and it's a bit of push and pull, right? Because you can try and force behavior and incentivize certain behavior, but at the end of the day, Americans love their cars. People love driving, like getting into their individual car. And this is borne out over many years of my experience in multiple housing projects. So my questions about this, first off, when you refer to car share, I might think Zipcar. Is car sharing still a thing? I haven't done a car share in like 15 years. I don't know anyone. I didn't know that was still a thing. I'm being very honest, and maybe it is. But why would someone use a car share if they can just have an Uber pick them up and not have to worry about parking the car?
Good question. I'm an elder millennial. I'm gonna let a younger millennial answer that question. Taylor.
I live in Oakland. We have, in my neighborhood, we have like ones that park on the street. Oakland has an agreement with them, so they like park on the street. They're more used for like if you're going to do a trip where you're like, I'm gonna go to Target, I
Right.
need to get X, Y, and Z, I need something to put in my vehicle and I don't want to have to wait for an Uber each way. But yeah, that's a valid point. But like for people just trying to get to a destination and then come back, maybe an Uber is a better situation. Once again, as Elizabeth said, we're flexible and adding things or
Maybe it's
changing
like
it.
loading areas. I
That's
know-
what I actually put here, like, what about having like curb cut for Uber, Lyft, or like an AV pickup or something of that sort, right? I just worry about having a spot that's now dedicated to an antiquated service that it's like, usage is not growing, right? And you've required a spot to be for a Zipcar that sits no one uses.
Yeah.
Just a thought there. Bus shelter. How would that work for a developer to say, oh, I'm gonna build a bus shelter? Don't they have to coordinate with AC Transit?
Yeah, in the regulations, it says the bus shelter design has to be approved by the city of Hayward and AC Transit. AC Transit has very specific design like guidelines about what their shelter has to be and how it has to look. So ultimately, just the developer builds what they normally have as their shelter.
And it's basically just saying, we have a lot of bus stops that don't have shelters, they're just benches or like a pole out there. So this would be helping fill in that gap to make like waiting for the bus a little bit more attractive, a little easier. Bus shelters also sometimes have like electronic signs that say like next bus in 15 minutes and things like that. So it would be more going to the current bus infrastructure, where the current bus stops are, and if there's one that's deficient in the area,
Got
then you can get your points for that, or you get your reduction.
I was gonna say I could build a bus stop in front of my building and there's no bus service there, but I've met your demand.
0 points
So,
for
yeah,
that,
okay. Okay. And then finally, the thought on this TDM piece, and I'm thinking about this too at Sohe, and we're facing this right now on our homeowners association. Physical infrastructure versus like programmatic infrastructure, right? And what happens if you've granted, I dare I say a license or authority or allowance for a reduction in parking because the developer says they're gonna buy bus passes for everyone. And that happens for the first 3, 4, 5 years, but 10 years later, it's just fallen off. No one's buying the bus pass. And now that physical infrastructure is lacking in necessary parking. That's what my concern is, that some of these programs, what enforcement do we have and should we be enforcing it when the reality is that memories are short. And again, people like their cars. And if you have created a program where the physical property didn't need to have enough parking spaces, but yet there's demand, those cars are going to go somewhere. They're going to go out onto the street and we still have a problem with parking.
It's a hard thing to regulate. What we put in ours is that the property owner has to enter a written agreement that sets forth that they have to do this and guarantee there will be no substantial alterations that will create a greater demand for parking without the city's knowledge and improvement. So it would probably be an agreement, we'll go to our city attorney's office. And that is how we handle it, but I think we're open to like other enforcement methods. I also know that our transportation department is working on like a full TDM program for the city, where they will monitor this and that. It's not there yet, but this could be tied into that and they can monitor it through that program.
Yeah, just add that TDM programs obviously are very well intentioned,
Right.
not always very well executed. And it really, as I think everybody recognizes, it really requires a shift in behavior, which sometimes it's easier said than done. So I think your point is well taken, Chair Ellie Sullivan. I think having flexibility in a TDM, there may be things that maybe not on this list that haven't even been invented yet. That could be an option 5 or 10 years down the road that we would want to embrace. I mean, I will tell you, no one ever thought of Uber and Lyft 20 years ago, and I never thought that I could, just get a shared vehicle on the street either. Although I'm dating myself.
I'm sorry.
So, no, it's all good. But I think to your point is that, the individual tenants are going to influence their behavior and I think what this project is trying to do is to provide other options for people getting in their car. And what we found, and many studies have supported this, is that unless you have a viable alternative, no one's going to get out of their car. You need something that's reliable, whether it's regular bus service, frequent bus service, or whether there's another option like car share or Uber that could supplement someone's need to have a vehicle. And obviously, we're talking about the here and now, but I think your point is well taken, that just being flexible and even a well-intentioned TDM program, if it's not working, maybe they need to try something else. It doesn't mean that the TDM isn't effective. It just means that that particular measure may not be as embraced as maybe something else.
That's fair. Let's see. Okay, I'm off my parking rant. Next question regarding setbacks. I assume that you tossed it in a regression and out comes a number at the end of that regression, i.e. are slimming down necessary setbacks. We're able to increase potential housing output by X amount. And apologies for perhaps not asking this ahead of time, but I'm wondering I'm assuming this is meant to achieve something, right? And you've identified what we can achieve here. So what do, to Commissioner Stevens' questions around sort of concerns around those setbacks and zero lot lines, et cetera, is there a significant benefit by slimming, i.e. in number of housing stock we'll be able to add, which might perhaps mitigate some of those concerns that we have about slimming those setbacks?
Yeah, if Poonam is available, I'll start this answer and then my mic is over to you as you really dug into this analysis and the options and recommendations report. When it comes to how many units you can fit on a site, there's a lot of variables that go into that. The height of it, the setbacks of it, the open space requirements of it, the parking is a huge one. We heard loud and clear from folks that we don't want to reduce the parking standards. You know, maybe with the exception of if they provide some of these TDM strategies. So we tried to pull all the other levers to, especially for the RM, the RH districts, to push back the setbacks a little bit, to increase the height a little bit, to be more intentional about our open space. In terms of specific numbers, and again, Poonam's not going to have specific numbers.
Yeah, no, I assume that there's some benefit though to reducing the
Yes,
setbacks. Right? It opens up unbuildable land.
Correct. And
Yeah.
Poonam just as the person, you'll remember all those cute little diagrams from the old ones that show these tiny little buildings that were all we could get. All of these recommendations came from that report, including reducing the setbacks so we can get a more developable or a larger buildable envelope. But Poonam, I'll turn to you.
Yeah, if I heard the question correctly, I think we're kind of reconsider, or the question is why the 10-foot setback, or how did we arrive at the 10-foot setback, right? And as Elizabeth was explaining, we did take into consideration the development feasibility on the parcel. The 20-foot setback was definitely turning out to be quite a constraint when trying to accommodate the parking requirement, accommodating actually enough number of units to meet the allowable density. And to the previous comment that Commissioner Stevens also made was, why 10-foot and not why built to line? I think that we determined that it needed to be less than 20 feet. And I think, again, this is part of this study session is to understand, what is the comfort level of, whether or not we want to have a setback in the residential neighborhoods, or do we want to build to line, right? A lot of the mixed use development, especially along Mission Boulevard, is probably much more suitable for build to line, where you do require, there's benefit to bringing the ground floors, especially non-residential ground floors, all the way up to the property line. When it comes to your residential uses, that are, if you have residential units at the ground level, you do want to think about privacy. And some ways to do that is, giving the ground floor an elevation of the grade level, but also allowing for a landscape buffer in front of the residential unit so that there is a certain amount of privacy incorporated into the design. So, a 5-foot setback can also provide you a good landscape buffer, but I think we landed at a 10-foot setback because it gave enough room not only for a landscape buffer, but also did not feel that the building, if it is a 4-story building, that it is overwhelming for a pedestrian on a residential street, which is typically going to be relatively narrower than a street like Mission Boulevard. So it does come down to also, the distance between building face to building face, that ratio with the total height of the building. We are writing citywide standards, and so it's going to be really hard to identify unique conditions on each, from one neighborhood to the other. And so the 10-foot setback sort of seemed like an appropriate medium, that would work for most street widths within your city. But I think we can consider going less than 10 feet if that's a recommendation that the Planning Commission wants to make. We can study that.
Yeah, it might be helpful to see what the numbers look like if you can, if it opens up 10,000 more housing units, I'm sure it's not, but some significant number, then maybe that would inform the decision. Yeah, exactly.
I'm not sure that it's going to give us necessarily higher number of residential units, because also, when we studied example parcels within each of the zoning districts, if you allow for a building height that we have recommended, that Elizabeth was presenting in the table, actually that the flexibility of the building height will give you more residential units than the setback. Like reducing the setback from 10 feet to 5 feet is not going to give you a significantly higher number of units. What it will give you is, maybe an open space, outdoor open space behind the building with a little bit more privacy.
Got it. Thank you very much. And then my very last thing, thank you all for bearing with my litany of questions here. Question for discussion number 2 regarding the Mission Boulevard Code area. Just to clarify, if I read staff report correct, right now we are not objectively looking at Mission Boulevard. So it's not a matter of do we support this, but we need to make this change in order to be objective in our standards, correct?
Yeah, staff has started the process of going through the downtown code and Mission Boulevard code. They were both just written so much more recently that they're already very objective and very detailed on standards, which is why it hasn't been the focus of this project. That said, there is a section of about 5 or 6 design standards, it's not a ton, in the Mission Boulevard code that are subjective. They're not objective.
Can you give an example?
Which I have my laptop.
They basically say like the building has to use similar materials to the surrounding ones, which is not objective because you could
It
choose
needs to have a variation in form, things that like they want to achieve, but it's not written in the concrete language that we've written the language here in. So basically our question there is to say, do you think this language, these menu of options, maybe a point system for architectural design, do you think that's appropriate just to use the same system for Mission Boulevard? It's still allowing the greater heights and setbacks and stuff like that, Mission Boulevard? Or do you think that needs a totally different approach?
Okay, yeah, I don't entirely have an answer there, but I do think that begs the question, Commissioner Stevens, that you were sort of alluding to regarding architectural standards and what is subjective versus objective in wanting nice architecture along Mission Boulevard versus just you met the base minimum requirements of housing, so we're going to grant you that, right? I'd rather see something nice on Mission than just something that meets the base level standard. All right, why don't we, Commissioner Stevens, please, yeah.
So Commissioner Lowe, actually, I was kind of thinking about what she was saying about, projects advancing through and maybe when they're constructed, not actually looking like what was approved and those crafty architects coming up with all kinds of great ways to fool us. And I was just looking, and I think that it's great that there are objective standards listed in here. And I'm looking at the multi-unit residential for 4+ units. And I look at the facade design, and I was thinking to myself, now if I was a developer and I know I need to pick 3 of the following elements. Of these 3 elements, I might pick the 4-inch window recess, the window moldings that are 4 inches, and I might then choose the 2 distinct building materials. I mean, that's pretty easy to achieve versus, all these other great variations of roof height. Or this, the one, number 3, use of at least 3 arches, columns, beams, lintels, or other features, right? I think about that is Not sure. I mean, can I just like put an arch and affix it to the edge of the building and call it good? I mean, it's subjective, but it seems to be I don't know, difficult to interpret.
And I think therein lies the big challenge with objective standards. Poonam and Taylor and I have had this back and forth constantly. Poonam's an architect, so she is saying like, they'll know what we mean, you know, like put in this, put in that. We can tell you from experience, as can Jeremy, we have a range of developers in Hayward. Sometimes we get architects who like have beautiful designs that come through. Sometimes we get, you know, first-time developers, kind of mom and pop, you know, that are just looking to see if they meet requirements. And to some developers, yeah, just throwing on, you know, like one set of beams or, you know, an arch here or there, that would potentially meet requirements. The struggle with objective design standards is that in order for them to be enforceable, they have to be specific. It has to be something that somebody who has no design background would understand what that meant the same degree that I am. So, you know, we can't come to different interpretations. So what we have been going back and forth with as we've been drafting standards, taking out standards, revising standards, is if there's anything that we can't meaningfully make objective, we've taken it out of the code. That said, again, this is our first pass at this. If there's any standards that you want to see us work on more, want to see us add to the code, other codes that you're familiar with that have good standards we could potentially look at, we are all ears. But yes, we've had this exact struggle in putting together these standards. I think a lot of communities have. But at the end of the day, if something is not objective, we can't enforce it. So there's no point in having it in the code.
You know, my suggestion would be number one, look at those gallows.
Okay.
And then I like ratios, like, you know, windows shall be 25% of the surface area.
Okay.
You know, the ratio of the frame around the window should be 10%, something along those lines. I mean, an architect, right? The rule of three, you know, that whole thing. I mean, they probably could come up with that. And I really think that these should also apply to the Mission Boulevard specific contract. I totally think it can be aggregated and made everything simple. I think that would be a really good approach. Thank you.
All right, why don't we go ahead and open up public comment, then we can come back to finish off with commissioners. Doesn't appear to be anyone in the room, so is there anyone online? If anyone online wishes to make public comment on this item, please raise your hand. We'd be happy to hear from you.
We have two attendees that have raised their hand.
Great. And we do have a timer, so appreciate our speakers keeping it to 3 minutes. Thank you so much.
Okay, Rogue Aguilar, if you can please, oh, there you go, thank you.
Good evening, members of the Planning Commission and staff. I too want to compliment the staff on this revision of the residential Hayward residential design standards. I think they did very good work. My husband and I gave our input, and I think the direction that this is going is in line with the strategic plan and the goals and objectives of the city to build more diverse housing. So I want to compliment you on that. We know that the strategic plan, the zoning ordinance, the revision of the density bonus ordinance, all speak to inclusionary housing and the importance of inclusionary housing. And from what I've read, most of this looks like it would allow for more flexibility in building, and thus perhaps more inclusionary housing. And so I want to encourage the staff, and I think it would be helpful to all of us if you reviewed this draft through the lens of inclusionary housing, are there any designs which would discourage or work against inclusionary housing? And see if we can modify those. So I compliment, the reduction in the setback, but can we go to 5? Would that help with flexibility and inclusionary housing? Flexibility in building height definitely help with inclusionary housing. So is there anything in there that you think would discourage or hinder inclusionary housing? That's my question, and I think it would be helpful to know that, given the importance of inclusionary housing in the city's strategic plan and zoning ordinance and density bonus revision. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Aguirre. I have to say, if I remember correctly, I don't believe you joined the last meeting, and so I was happy to see you here because I know you always have lots of comments and are very engaged. Thank you for joining this evening in the comments. I believe we have one more speaker, Ms. Pottis. That's right.
Correct, Chair Alison have comment on third level. So let me go ahead and if you can share.
Can you hear me?
Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Colin Thormoto, and I'm a member of the Community Services Commission. The changes as proposed do a lot to encourage denser development in Hayward and simplify the zoning ordinances. I want to congratulate city staff and the consulting group for their work on that. The new chart for residential zones is super legible and I love it. However, I do have some changes which I encourage the commission and city staff to consider during the upcoming discussion. According to the resident satisfaction survey, housing and homelessness are top concerns. We're also in the midst of a climate breakdown due to carbon emissions, much of which in California are caused by motor vehicle use. Zoning is a tool which can help tackle both of these issues simply by designing for people. The use of zones as they exist now are a barrier to gradual and diversified development. Since over 20,000 parcels are zoned for single-family housing, there is no way, other than a planned development rezoning, to do more than a triplex, which must include the additional massing restrictions. Allowing one-step densification by right, for example, from duplex to quadplex or two-story to three-story, would allow smaller developers to gradually create denser housing where it is needed without waiting a decade for planned development zones to create ultra-dense housing all at once. This smaller scale densification will be steady, gradual, and at smaller risk of failure or opposition due to the scale. Also, the massing restriction as proposed would prohibit the kind of pedestrian-friendly areas that have historically existed. From Kyoto to Istanbul to Prague to Boston, enclosed spaces approaching a 1-to-1 building height to street width ratio have been the norm. I readily admit nobody wants gray boxes everywhere, but there are some other ways of addressing this issue that don't prohibit buildings like the Painted Ladies in San Francisco or the brownstones in New York or literally downtown Hayward. These buildings are efficient, pedestrian-friendly, and can be used for a variety of purposes without demolition. Lastly, I encourage you all to consider expanding the allowable uses to encourage entrepreneurship and make neighborhoods properly walkable. As the housing element highlighted, most of the city is designated as low resource, according to the 2021 TCAC Opportunity Areas Report. When I lived in South Hayward for a long time, the closest grocery store was in Union City. By expanding the allowable uses in historically residential areas, local stores and businesses can open where people are, encouraging walkability and neighborhood vibrancy. In summary, I appreciate the work done so far and encourage us as a city to think bolder on zoning. I encourage the commissioners and staff to consider rethinking massing restrictions to encourage pleasant, walkable neighborhoods, expand allowable uses to encourage the development of neighborhood amenities, and allow one-step density increases by right to encourage gradual, coherent development. These steps will ensure Hayward is built for the people who live within it, allowing housing for more people, making neighborhoods more livable, and our city more environmentally friendly. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate the comments. Do we have anyone else online?
Here, we don't have any.
Go ahead and close public comment. Appreciate folks that were able to join online. I think we've given you a lot of thoughts, comments, questions here. I'm sure maybe we'll do another quick round if any of the commissioners have any final thoughts or comments. Please, Commissioner Kumba.
Commissioner Ellie Sullivan. I had just a follow-up with the last speaker in public comment regarding thinking outside the box and just be creative with use, more amenity, neighborhood amenities, like what he said. And my recommendation or suggestion to staff is to maybe, I'm looking at table 4 on the staff report. Where we're talking about open space amenities and associated points values. And when we're looking at the indoor spaces, for example, the community rooms, I would encourage staff to consider maybe a category or adding some points to maybe joint projects in the high density projects. I know that there is a lot of empty ground floor spaces in some of the previously approved projects. And so I'm wondering if maybe we can use those spaces to provide services to the residents and the greater Hayward community, and maybe add points or encourage like a joint kind of partnership with maybe a satellite library, like the Hayward Library, or a health center, or Chabot Las Citas College District, or Hayward Adult School. So I want to thank the speaker for planting that seed.
Thank you. And actually that prompted just one other comment here for me, including on that same table 4. Again, looking at the point allocations, this caught my eye when I was reading the first time, amphitheater with seating for at least 25 people. And I was looking at the high value items. Not quite sure what is envisioned here. My thoughts on this though, if I'm looking at perhaps an amphitheater versus say a co-working space with Wi-Fi tables, seating and a bathroom, I would assume that that gets much more use than an amphitheater. Or a basketball court probably gets more use than an amphitheater. And so, what of the amenities, whether indoor or outdoor, are going to be used versus what's maybe like a really nice thing to say you have, but gets used 2 times a year. I think is important not to discourage an amphitheater, but should be worth more than so many other things, maybe not. So, but overall, yeah, again, I love the point system. I think we talked about it close to a year ago when we started this process. So to see it come alive is awesome. Commissioner Gari, please.
So one more question in sort of light of preparing for the future and preparing for kind of large environmental changes. I'm not quite sure how these design regulations might impact this, but one of the things I remember is that from the shoreline studies is that in a number of different scenarios, many parts of Hayward are going to be subject to groundwater encroachment. And so I'm curious whether that's what we looked into, is how these design changes might affect that, or whether you need to do something to ensure that new construction is sort of prepared for scenarios that the city has already mapped and are going to happen.
Thankfully, unlike other communities in the Bay Area, predominantly the areas impacted by sea level rise and groundwater emergence are industrial or commercial. Throughout our city, there are some policies in the Shoreline Adaptation Master Plan and now within our proposed like safety element and things like that to update like our floodplain ordinance and stuff to have higher finished floors or think about more bioretention and things like that. But none of them are included specifically in this project, but it's something that the city is going to do.
So I hand it please, Commissioner Patterson.
Thank you. So this actually, when one of your questions, Chair Ali Sullivan, is actually what prompted my thinking around this. I was just wondering when it comes to the TDM measures and just thinking about trying to do behavior changes. Is there already like a study or something that's been done about Hayward residents' driving patterns and like how many people are commuting just through the city versus outside to a neighboring city versus over a bridge? Because I feel like those things really impact whether you feel like you need a car. And so I'm wondering, like, with some of that knowledge even help come up with strategies to actually support the realities of the community. I know the community does shift and change, but just wondering.
I could just weigh in here a little bit. So Alameda County Transportation Mission actually has been working very diligently for a lot of projects to come up with kind of a menu of options for TDM. Obviously, a bus shelter in a location that doesn't have any service doesn't make any sense. So they've created a very similar kind of point system for projects that are required to reduce vehicle miles traveled. I don't want to get into too much of an environmental stuff here. It's very technological and there's a lot of methodology that goes into it, but it basically says that if you live in certain areas that would require you to drive because there's no other suitable option to get around, you would have to come up with other means. Some cases it's adding bike lanes, other cases, if you're a business providing employees passes to BART or other sort of transit. It's really intended to be a suite of options, realizing that not every location is going to be suitable for every option. And so really trying to be very development specific. Some locations are going to be more prone and, you don't want to offer a BART pass to somebody who is, 4 miles from a BART station. That's probably not going to be, that you're not going to get the same result because it's going to require that they get into a car or get into some vehicle to get to that BART station. So Alameda County has developed something like that. And I think our Public Works and Transportation Planning Division is also looking at something very similar. And that was part of what we did when we did our general plan update a couple of years ago with going from used to be going from a trip generation model to a vehicle miles travel model. It all kind of filters into this TDM strategy. So I definitely think we can do that. I think there's been a lot of great examples. I certainly would not necessarily want to compare Hayward to San Francisco in terms of success at TDM because we're still a quasi suburban community that does not have the same kind of infrastructure. But that's not to say 10 years from now that doesn't change. So I would agree. I think there are a lot of studies, and I think that is the basis for some of our recommendations because we're not quite there yet, but I think that's the vision.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I can barely see my GIS classes in planning school. Like, yes, there's literally census data that says the people that live here, this is where they work. The people that work here, this is where they live. I will say for the scope of this project, which is grant funded and limited, I don't know that we can do a ton of deep diving on this, but another option just to throw out there to this group, as Taylor said, our Public Works Department has it on their long-term plan to be developing a citywide TDM program. Maybe we're being a little premature here of including something here. Maybe we just want to hold off until we have some of those deeper studies. I mean, we do feel like some of these measures that we have with the tweaks that you suggested are appropriate to adopt at this time, we can. But in terms of, as Jeremy said, we referenced some best practices, counties, other cities. Going into much more detail at this point is just probably not in the cards for this project, but it could be for the next like full body TDM program. So just something else to consider.
I just want to respond to the last statement as you guys think about the feedback received from the commission. Again, because these are design standards that will be in place for decades, I would encourage, I would like to see as we kind of the next iteration of this kind of, I don't want to chuck the idea of putting TDM parking reduction options into these design standards right now. I think we've asked a lot of questions that are kind of, how do we design for today and the future? So I'd love to see some more creativity, and I don't know if that can even be procedural, like there's if for something that is more process, like Chair Ali Sullivan brought up, then maybe you have to have a 5-year review or something along those lines. I don't know if that's feasible in the way that design standards are written, but that may be one option as well. So I would love to kind of see some creative ideas here because I think as also one of the public comments brought up, do have to move to a future. I'm from Detroit, like I love cars, but it's not workable, I think, in reality for this area, both from a kind of climate preparedness standpoint and just sort of livability. Traffic is horrible And so I think I want to see that. I
Yeah.
just think we have to be kind of mindful of how it impacts residents today.
Thank you, Commissioner Gordon. I hate to do this. The more we think about this, more questions and thoughts come up. The conversation can keep going. Very briefly, on the TDM piece, was there any thought, and just planting a seed here, of creating a similar point allocation system? So I'm looking at this chart, and I think it also said that you can only do one of these items. You can only choose one. Should we create a system where you have a suite of TDM measures? And if you get, and they're all have points allocated to them, and if you do 2 things, you get a 10% reduction. If you do 4 things, you get a 15% reduction. So that, again, think about incentives. It might sort of incentivize different outcomes here. So just a thought that came to me this moment. You guys can mull on it. All right, I think we'll wrap the discussion for now, but again, I appreciate both of your work on this and presenting to us on this topic, and I really appreciate my fellow commissioners for the questions and comments that came up. Hopefully there's good meaty pieces here that you all can use and think through. Sorry to continue to give you more work on this, but hopefully it'll help inform the final product here a little bit.
If you'll allow us, Taylor and I were kind of sharing notes here. I think we have a lot of clarity on our 5 questions. There's 2 things we'd just love to get a little bit more direction from. Maybe we heard from one person. I just want to get a read on the rest of the commission. First of all, a couple of you talked about the small lot, single family residential projects being in support of that. Is it fair to say generally the commission is in support of us developing some sort of system or streamlined process for small lot, single family, or does anyone have any concerns about that?
I don't see any concerns. I actually just read there was a Wall Street Journal article this week about this interest in these small homes. So yeah.
Very popular. Okay, so that was question 1. And then question 2 is Commissioner Stevens brought up, just like we talked about TDM points now, maybe exploring points for the architectural kind of design detail standards. Is there also, we're happy to flesh that out. Is there kind of general support for that, having, instead of having a menu of options and saying pick 3, maybe saying this option's worth 10 points, this option's worth 5 points, or something that's a little more weighted, like the open space. Is there general support for that as well? Support that. At least to explore. We can always like put something out there and go like, nope, take that back, give us the menu of options back. We can always.
Yep, I think if there's a way to incentivize not going to the lowest common denominator for each windows, then yeah, let's.
And the way to do that is a weighted point system. Yeah, okay. Well, we'll work on some revisions here. And the next time we're planning on coming back to you for adoption hearings, but you'll be making a recommendation to council. So if we didn't get it quite right, you still have some future tweaks for us, we can definitely make that before we actually get to the final council.
Wonderful. All right, we'll go ahead and close off the first item, the work session item, and we will go on to our second item, which is the approval of minutes of the planning commission meeting on June 22nd, 2023. We can all take a quick look at that. And
I move that we approve the minutes.
I'll second that.
I believe Commissioner Goodbody was going to move the minutes.
Oh, sorry.
So I'm gonna move to approve the amended report of the minutes from the June 22nd, 2023.
Right, and we all received the amended minutes. Hopefully you guys saw that. They were, someone with eagle eyes caught those adjustments. So thank you. I think that was you. Yes, thank you. So we have a motion and a second. Commissioner Stevens seconded. All right, we'll go ahead and vote on the minutes. Ms. Potts, if you could call roll, please. Or if you'd like me to, Mike, you're perfect.
Commissioner Stevens,
Yes.
Commissioner Goodbody,
Yes.
Commissioner Lowe,
Yes.
Commissioner Patterson,
Aye.
Commissioner Gart, aye. Chair Always Lovick.
Aye. All right, looks like the minutes are moved. So we will go ahead and move on to commissioner reports. Mr. Kirko, do you have any reports? So I'm sure you do. We've been gone for a while.
Well, we've been gone for a while,
Yeah.
absolutely. I've had just a couple of really quick updates. Just to let the commission know that the city council took action earlier this week. They completed their interviews of potential planning commission or inquiries or for potential commissioners for the one vacancy that we have. They did make a selection and they did also approve an alternate. And so as of now, that candidate will be sworn in on September 12th. And congratulations to 3 existing commissioners that received reappointment. We have 3 of them that will continue on with the Hayward Planning Commission. So congratulations. The next meeting, our new commissioner will be joining us, which will be September 14th. We currently have 2 items that will be planned for that evening.
Give us something spicy for the first meeting.
Something spicy for the first meeting. I can't, everyone has a different spice level, so I'll just say there's gonna be 2 items for consideration. I don't know that they're gonna be quite as meaty as the discussion that we had tonight, but that's okay. They're both projects that have been in the works for quite a while, so we look forward to bringing those forward to the commission for action. And outside of that, I hope everyone has a wonderful and safe Labor Day coming up in less than 2 weeks. Hopefully everyone had a wonderful, safe summer. So that is it for my announcements tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Kirk. Appreciate it. Any commissioner announcements or updates? All right, well, I will just say it's good to be back. It's been a long couple of months and I'm happy to see everyone here. Looking forward to having a full house in 3 weeks from now with all 7 of us. So wonderful. Well, barring any additional items, we will go ahead and close out the meeting at 8:54 p.m. And I will do my favorite part of the night,